Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today, we're going to be looking at a item which is I don't really think a very good unique, to be perfectly frank, but it is definitely a unique. And we're going to be talking about it today. This one is called the Fields of Crimson, and the Fields of Crimson is a ancestral or sacred two-handed sword, which can be found in World Tier 3 or World Tier 4. Now, because it is a weapon, you're definitely going to want to find it at 820, or as close to 820 as you can possibly get it, item power. And that's just simply because item power is so strongly attached to the damage output that these particular weapons have. So if you're using a crappy Fields of Crimson on a high-level character, it's not going to do you very much good. You would probably be better off just using an 820 until you get your hands on an 820 of Fields of Crimson and then swapping over. Now, the Fields of Crimson is a two-handed sword, so it does have the basic 38.5% critical strike damage. This, of course, goes up when you have a higher item power. As you can see, mine is 49% critical strike damage on this one. And on top of that, it also has some static effects. So it has 15.4% damage to two-handed slashing weapons, 15.4 to 30.8, which does go up when you upgrade it. 17.6% damage over time, 15.4% to 30.8%. And then it has 11.5% rupture cooldown reduction, which is 9 to 14.8%, Barbarian only, of course. And then we have 4 to 6 ranks of rupture on this particular item as well. Unfortunately, ranks of rupture really don't do much other than bring down the cooldown, so it kind of seems like they really want you to have the cooldown up all the time. It also has a special effect, which is while using this weapon, damaging at least one enemy with Rupture creates a blood pool that inflicts 717 to 1,354 bleeding damage over 6 seconds. Enemies standing in the pool take 10% increased bleeding damage. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it does allow you to upgrade this and upgrade that flat damage number. So, if you go to a vendor, doesn't matter, one of the upgrade vendors, and you go to upgrade this particular item, you will see that the item power is very strongly related to the effect on the item. So as you upgrade the item, it'll go from, say, 1,354 to 1,408, and so forth and so on. I don't want to waste my materials on this because it's not a good version of Fields of Crimson. It just happens to be the one that I found. It does have a flavor text, which is, we've been fighting these flesh eaters for so long, been soaked in so much blood, that after a while it's difficult to tell what side you're truly on. Now, the Fields of Crimson is, I don't know if it's really a good unique. To be perfectly honest with you, I feel like it's probably not worth using. That's my personal opinion. Now, I've had a conversation with several of the kinship members on this. Leon, Bob, actually quite a few people about Rupture. And honestly, with the exception of Bob, it seems like most of us are on the same page, which is Rupture is just really not worth using. And I'll explain myself. So, when you use the Rupture ability, for instance, if I use it right now, you can see it's a straightforward stab, which does a very quick attack, right? So if I run out here, and let me make sure that Rupture is, of course, set to the two-handed weapon, Fields of Crimson. And let's find a monster to stab in the face. Why not?
I'm low on fury.
As you can see, we got a little pool of blood on the ground. Nothing too amazing. Like, it's actually kind of tiny, right? My character's so weak if I'm not using my right abilities. Now, with Rupture, the main issue with this skill is that, number one, it requires you to actually build bleeds on the target for it to be useful. The entire point behind Rupture is that you skewer the enemies in front of you, dealing 974 to 1,191, 13% damage, which is pathetic. It's basically 1% higher than Rend already deals, but it doesn't come with the 96% bleed that Rend does. On top of this, you can set it up so that it does a bleeding damage over 5 seconds of 2,499, which is 30% of the weapon's damage. Not 30% of the bleed damage is currently on the target, but 30% of the weapon's damage, which is less than the 96% damage that Rend is currently doing. Rend is a much larger attack. And this is also very important when you talk about like Rend versus the other, is that you can basically hit like most of the monsters on the screen with Rend. It actually is pretty amazing in that regard, because it is a very nice frontal AoE cone, and it really just comes down to proper placement of your character so that you can literally hit everybody in front of you. Whereas Rupture doesn't really hit more than like one, maybe two monsters, which is another big issue between the two skills. So what is the functional purpose of Rupture? Like, let's talk about it from this perspective first. So the functional purpose of Rupture is to solidify the bleeding damage that you have on the target. So in other words, if I have 1,000 bleeding damage on a target, and they will take that 1,000 damage in the next 5 seconds, which if you look at Rend, which is your main bleed, Rend's bleed lasts for 5 seconds, okay? So 5 seconds is how long it's going to take me to dish out that 1,000 damage. If I hit them with Rend, it will rip out all of the bleeding damage, removing it from the target, and then it will dish out that bleeding damage that I'm doing to the target already as a solid hit to the target, right? So it's not doing additional damage. It is just taking my existing damage and applying it to the target more quickly. But the thing is that in the same time period, I could use Rupture. I could also just simply be using another Rend, or another 2 Rends even, because the Rupture skill is kind of slow in the way that it attacks. Like, it kind of goes out, and then it comes in, right? So it's not just a shing, it's like a shing, and then a shing. So it's basically like 2 attacks in that same time period, which means I could just attack with Rend 2 more times in that same exact time period. The other thing that really kind of bothers me about Rupture is that it feels like you'd be better off just using, like, anything else in that slot. Just anything. Like, I mean, I'm serious. Anything. Like, you could go through the tree and you could pull out 100 different skills that I think would be more useful. Let me give you an example. Steel Grasp. Let's just use this one. Steel Grasp is a trio of chains that drags enemies in, right? Pulls them in. Why would this be more useful than Rupture? Because, well, if I can drag the monsters in, I can Rend more monsters at one time. So if I can pull them in, then I have a larger group of monsters that I can Rend at one time. And this is also a really big issue, is that while Rupture can hit 1 or maybe 2 monsters and dish out that bleeding damage directly to those 1 or 2 monsters, Rend, however, can hit literally everything in front of me. And if I were to replace Rupture with Steel Grasp, I could then hit literally everything in front of me with Rend, as opposed to 1 or 2 monsters with Rupture. The other thing is that in the same duration of time that I could be using Rupture on, say, 1 or 2 monsters, because that's really the only place that Rupture becomes useful, is those 1 or 2 monsters that are very tough. Like bosses, like really high damage, HP elites and things like that. The problem with it is it's really only useful in certain situations. Like at the last couple points of HP when the boss is about to die, being able to finish off the boss quicker can be handy, but it's really only useful during that small time window before he's about to die. Not during the entire boss fight, because during the entire boss fight, it's actually far more beneficial just to simply spam Rend and spam Flay on the target repeatedly and stacking those bleeds over and over and over again, which they do indeed stack. So it may do, say, 8,096 bleeding damage over 5 seconds right now, but I can apply that bleed multiple times. And there's also only a small window where everything is overlapping. So if I have, like, you know, I don't know, like what, 5 bleeds. Let's say I can attack at least 1 time per second, so I can have 5 bleeds on a target that are all overlapping. There's only going to be a very small window of time where the Rupture is going to do its highest damage output because of the fact that all of the bleeds are overlapping during that one time period. You got your Flay bleeds, you've got your Rend bleeds, you've got your bleeds that are coming from things like your Thorns, whatever it may be, but they're all stacking on the target, but they're all stacking on the target for a very short time. If my bleeds were like 10, 15, 20 seconds, maybe 25 seconds or something like that, I could see Rupture being a little bit more useful of an ability. But the main problem with Rupture is that number one, it just takes way too long to like refresh its cooldown. Without Fields of Crimson, it has a very long cooldown of 8.6 seconds, and as we just talked about, all the bleeds expire in 5. So
I need more fury.
you're basically at a situation where you can only use this ability like maybe once at the end of every other bleed rotation. And then once you put on the Fields of Crimson, it does give you the ability to cast it more often. So obviously the +6 ranks to Rupture and also the cooldown reduction that's on the weapon make it so that it's a little bit more eminently spammable. But another issue with this, though, is that you can't spam it. So Rupture requires that you build bleeds for it to do anything. It doesn't work as an ability on its own. You can't just spam Rupture. You can't just use it without the attacks. So you've got to go through your entire rotation. You have to build your Flay. You've got to put your bleed damage modifier on there. You've got to utilize your Rend multiple times. You can set it up so that you can spam Rend basically for free the entire time, which is absolutely amazing, by the way. I definitely recommend that if you're going to do a Rend build, you take a look at this because I think it's you only need one aspect that allows you to gain a huge amount of fury back every single time you rend. And then you could set it up with something like the Ring of Umbral, which would give you fury, essence back, or sorry, fury back every single time you hit a crowd control target. And before too long, you should be able to basically utilize Rend as your main ability. Basically forever, which is freaking amazing. And the only time you would utilize Flay is to grab that bleed damage and the vulnerable effect so that you could then start rending the crap out of whatever it is that you're rending. And once you get Rend set up properly, you can spam the ever-loving crap out of it. And then it becomes a question of, am I better off just spamming Rend more? Or using Rupture every once in a while to pull those bleeds off? And I think that the answer to the question is that it's not worth using. I think that's the answer to the question. The answer to the question is that in bleed builds, I feel like you would be much better off just taking Rupture completely out of the equation, putting something else in that spot. Death Blow, Steel Grasp, maybe throw in another shout, like Challenging Shout, Rallying Cry, or War Cry. Maybe you want to run all 3 shouts together, which is a pretty common thing these days. Maybe you want to throw in a stun with Ground Stomp, or maybe you want some mobility with Leap, or maybe you just, really want to grab like one of the ultimates that you don't have on your bar yet. The answer to the question, unfortunately for me, is that I just don't think Rupture works out well in a bleed build because of the way that it is not useful 100% of the time. And I think that's the most important and most glorious takeaway that I can give you for Rupture and why you probably shouldn't have it on your bar, is that it is not useful the majority of the time. I would say that 90 to 95% of the time, Rupture is basically useless. And this is coming from a person who has played a Bleed Barbarian and has messed around with the skill quite a bit. The majority of the time, you would just be better off spamming more Rends. The majority of the time. In the very few situations where Rupture can be useful, and I will admit that there are some very few situations where Rupture can be useful. And in those very few situations where Rupture can be useful, yes, it is useful. You know what? Let's go double check this bleed pool thing, because I think I may have messed up earlier and not shown off the bleed pool properly. There we go. There's the bleed pool. There's the
Need
bleed
more
pool.
fury. I'm not ready
I don't know
yet.
why the bleed pool. I don't know why it didn't automatically choose the two-handed weapon. That seems really silly. And that's just a lesson for all of you guys, that even someone like me can make this mistake, is that you need to make sure that you are checking that your weapon is set to the correct weapon choice, or your skill is set to the correct weapon. So in my case, gotta kill all these monsters. Get out of my face. In my case, what you have to do is you have to actually press S. You got to hold over the skill, so you got to hold over Rupture, and then you got to click with the center mouse wheel until it changes to the correct weapon. So let's go over that again. So the Rupture ability has a bleeding pool that goes underneath of it like this, as you can see. That's basically the special effect of Rupture. And it also gives you a 10% increased bleeding damage to any bleeding effects that go on while they're inside that pool. It's a decently sized pool. I mean, it's not like it's tiny, as you can clearly see. It's big enough that this would be like close range. I mean, this is about the range of a close attacks. And essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to get that pool underneath of them so that we can dish out more bleeding damage to them. I wish it would last a little longer, to be perfectly frank. 6 seconds doesn't really seem like an extremely long time to get that 10% increased bleeding damage, which is really the only thing that you're interested in when it comes to the bleeding pool. The bleeding damage that it does is nice, a nice addition, but it's not like super ridiculously useful. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough for an item that I don't even consider is worth using. I think I'm just going to go ahead and end it here. So, Fields of Crimson. Do I think it's worth using? Not really. I think it's probably one of the not good uniques. I think you'd be probably better off in a Bleed Barbarian specifically. I think you'd be probably better off just simply taking this slot and using it for something else that will enhance your bleeding damage better. And that's kind of one of the really bad things about the two-handed slots on the Barbarian, is that if you have a two-handed unique, doesn't matter what that two-handed unique is, it is now consuming the space for a two-handed legendary aspect, which are double power, right? So you can get, like up to 60% attack speed on a basic skill, or you can get like up to 40% if your primary resource is full, and so forth and so on. Like, these are things that are pretty massive in terms of how the damage outputs, and you're giving that double aspect up for this sword. And it's a sword that is based almost entirely around Rupture, and Rupture is not really a good ability. I'm sure people are going to fight me on this one, but if you are currently a Bleed Barbarian and you're using Rupture, I challenge you to take Rupture out of the equation, put something else in there, and watch. You really won't notice much of a difference, because Rupture is not really all that useful. It's not. 95% of the time, Rupture is not useful. The 5% of the time that Rupture is useful, I think you will find, and this is just my personal opinion, but I think you will find that it's not worth having Rupture on your bar for that 5% of the time. And the other thing is that they make it so ridiculously easy to respec. Like, at any time, I can just pull a couple points out here, put a couple points in there, so forth and so on, and before you know it, you've got, your character set up properly, right? Well, like, at any time, if you really felt like you needed Rupture, you could just pull a couple points out here or there, put them in there for whatever that 5% situation is that you feel like you need the ability for. Maybe it's a boss fight, maybe it's a really tough elite pack or something. And then when you're done, just take it back off and put something else on that's more useful. Because, like, versus trash mobs, it's garbage. Versus, like, most monsters in the game, it's garbage. Versus, like, even bosses, except for at the end of the boss fight, when you're actually dishing out damage to the boss itself. At, like, the very end of his HP bar, it's pretty much useless, except for that brief scenario. And if you do have that one specific elite that's kicking your butt and you'd like to kill them a little bit faster, it could be useful for that. But 95% of the time, it seems like Rupture is not worth using. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, and I hope that they eventually fix Rupture, because it does seem like a good idea in concept. And I'll also add this last bit just before I finish, is that Rupture kind of seems bugged at the moment, too, in the way that it dishes out its damage. Not sure if you guys have noticed, but it doesn't quite do its damage the way it's supposed to, or at least the way it's stated. And, yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, and keep watching.